Rome, 897 AD. There were no hymns, no prayers, only the stench of rot, the silence of awe, and a corpse dressed in sacred robes, seated on the papal throne. He had been dead for 9 months, buried with full honors. But today his body was exhumed, re-robed, and placed back on the throne, not to be honored, but to be judged. Yes, a dead pope was put on trial, before a court of clergy, before nobles and citizens, and before a church trembling beneath its own corruption. A deacon stood beside the corpse to answer on its behalf. There were accusations, there were arguments, there was a sentence, and there was something else, too, something darker, vengeance dressed as justice, power unhinged from sanity. What could possibly drive the Church of Christ, the institution of mercy and forgiveness, to desecrate its own dead, to chop off the fingers once used to bless the faithful, to drag a decomposed body through the streets, and to cast it into the filthy waters of the Tiber like a cursed dog? This wasn't legend, this wasn't metaphor. This was the Cadaver Synod, a real trial, a real corpse, and a Rome spiraling into madness. And to understand how such horror became possible, we must return to the moment when the doors of the Lateran Basilica creaked open, and the crowd gasped, as a corpse in papal vestments sat waiting to be condemned. The corpse on trial. The doors slammed open, and the air inside the basilica turned to stone. A procession entered, not with reverence but with dread. At the center, propped upright, robed in white and crimson, his skull half slumped, skin blackened and peeling, sat the body of Pope Formosus. 9 months dead, dug from the grave, dressed like a king of heaven, but reeked like the devil's forgotten child. He was tied to a throne so he wouldn't topple forward. His jaw, long dislocated, dangled slightly ajar, as if he were trying to scream but couldn't remember how. The scent hit first, sweet, putrid, layered with incense to mask the rot. But no amount of holy smoke could erase the reality. Rome's holiest man, now just a corpse, was about to be tried for crimes he took with him to the grave. And the people came. Priests, monks, soldiers, senators, nobles, and peasants. Some came in fear, some came in hatred. Some came for entertainment. They packed into the basilica, murmuring like flies circling meat. Rome was starving for spectacle, and today they were about to witness the ultimate blasphemy. This wasn't judgment in the eyes of God. This was theater drenched in vengeance, and vengeance always needed a stage. The prosecutor was Pope Stephen VI himself, a man barely clinging to sanity, his eyes sunken, his breath short, rage always simmering just beneath the surface. He stepped forward not like a priest, but like a butcher. In a voice sharpened by hatred, he began his accusations. That Formosus had ascended to the papacy illegally, that he violated holy law, that he conspired with enemies of the church, that he dared to move seas from Porto to Rome against canon decree. But under the thin veil of legalism, the real message bled through. You defied me, you humiliated me, you sided with the wrong emperor, and now even death won't save you. As Stephen ranted, his voice cracked with something more than anger, it was obsession. This wasn't justice, this was necromancy twisted into liturgy. His soldiers, barely hiding their disgust, stood guard beside the corpse, and a trembling deacon, appointed as Formosus's defense, stood awkwardly beside the body, answering yes, no, or I cannot respond to each charge, speaking for a man who no longer had breath nor dignity. It was absurd, it was terrifying, it was real. Spectators began to shift. Some whispered prayers, others swallowed bile. A few laughed nervously, but most just stared, unable to look away. There was something about it, something that felt more demonic than divine. This wasn't a church reclaiming order. This was a cult unraveling before its own God, and the Pope, the living Pope, looked less holy with every word he spit. Stephen's rage grew so hot, he nearly struck the corpse. But the body, rotting, slouched, withered, just sat there, slumped and mute, bearing the weight of a kingdom's paranoia. And yet, as grotesque as it all was, no one dared to intervene. Because beneath the horror there was fear, not of God, not of hell, but of power, raw, medieval, unhinged power. Because if the Pope could condemn a dead man, what could he do to the living? Then came the verdict. The court ruled Pope Formosus guilty, guilty of crimes against the Church, guilty of breaking sacred law, guilty of sin beyond the grave. And that's when the ceremony turned darker, when judgment gave way to ritual desecration. His sacred vestments were stripped from the corpse, one by one, torn like flesh from bone. His fingers, those 3 sacred fingers used to bless the faithful, were cut off at the joints with a knife that echoed across the chamber. Bloodless, yes, but the act was as violent as any execution. It was not punishment, it was erasure. And then the body was dragged down the marble steps of the altar, across the floor of the basilica, through the streets of Rome where dogs barked and children wept and crows began to circle above. All that remained of Pope Formosus was decay and disgrace. But Stephen wasn't finished, because what came next would damn them all, and it would begin with a river that had swallowed secrets for centuries until it swallowed a pope. The life before death. Before he was a corpse in robes, before his fingers were sliced from the bone, Formosus was a man. And like most men who rise too high in a rotten empire, he made enemies fast, some in whispers, some in armor, and some wearing the same holy garments as he did. He wasn't born into blood or title. He was a builder of power, brick by brick, favor by favor. First as Bishop of Porto, then as a diplomat to Bulgaria, then, after years of clawing through politics like a wolf in a silk collar, he sat on the throne of St. Peter. And the moment he did, Rome began to rot faster, because Formosus didn't come to save the Church, he came to bend it, to make it obey. Behind closed doors, he maneuvered kings and crowns like chess pieces. He blessed Arnulf of Carinthia to invade Italy and claim the imperial title, directly challenging the House of Spoleto, who had their own puppet king waiting in line. That wasn't just politics. It was treason in robes. It meant war. And in a world where popes crowned emperors, Formosus had just declared his allegiance with blood. His rise wasn't clean. He'd already been excommunicated once, accused of conspiring against the papacy itself. He was charged with abandoning his diocese, with ambition above obedience, with hungering for Rome more than for God. That kind of sin doesn't wash away with incense, but the Church was fractured, desperate, bleeding internally. And when desperate systems need strong hands, they often invite in the very devils that will later destroy them. So he was forgiven, not because he was holy, but because he was useful. Yet even as Pope, Formosus couldn't stop playing emperor-maker. He meddled in successions, betrayed allies, and warred with ghosts he couldn't kill. And through it all, he wore the face of sanctity, calm, solemn, almost divine. But behind the velvet and gold there was fear. He knew he was surrounded. He knew that one wrong move would mean ruin. And still he pushed. He called Arnulf again to march south, to dethrone Lambert, the Spoleto heir. It worked briefly. But Arnulf had a stroke mid-campaign. The army fell apart, and Formosus was left alone, exposed and encircled. He died shortly after, some say of a stroke, others whisper darker things. That his enemies found a way to silence him without spilling a drop of blood. That he was smothered in his chambers by men who prayed before and after the deed. But whatever the cause, when his body went cold, the war didn't end. It only changed shape, because Formosus had left behind a legacy soaked in betrayal. His blessings had rewritten imperial lines. His fingers had anointed kings and cursed dynasties. And those who survived him didn't just want him dead. They wanted him undone. They wanted every decree, every sacrament, every decision burned with the rotting shell of his corpse. He had crowned the wrong emperor. He had moved against the wrong family. And in the medieval world, that kind of blasphemy didn't die with the body. It was said that even in death, Formosus looked stubborn, that his face refused to collapse, that his hands, when exhumed, still curled slightly as if ready to bless or to strike. Maybe it was myth, or maybe it was Rome refusing to let go, because as long as Formosus had a name, the war wasn't over. And Stephen VI, newly robed, surrounded by vultures, whispering vengeance in his ear, was about to make sure that Formosus would never rest again. The puppet master Pope. Power never exists in a vacuum. It waits, it festers, it finds the hungriest man in the room and climbs inside him like a parasite. And when Pope Formosus died, that man was Stephen VI, a bishop from the fringes, molded not by holiness, but by hate. He wasn't supposed to be pope. He was supposed to obey. But in the rotting heart of Rome, where families clawed for control of the church like wolves fighting over a corpse, Stephen was lifted, not by divine grace, but by political hands slick with old blood. Behind him stood the Spoltans, Lambert, his mother Ageltrude, and every noble Formosus had crossed and cursed. They didn't need a pope, they needed a weapon. And Stephen, fragile, unstable, obedient, was perfect. But something inside Stephen broke when he sat on that throne. The weight of the mitre twisted his spine, sharpened his tongue, and poisoned his sleep. He began to see ghosts, ghosts in red silk, whispering in Latin, daring him to act. The dead pope haunted him, not just in memory, but in decree. Formosus had installed bishops, blessed emperors, handed out sacraments like they were his alone to give. And each one still living, still ruling, still threatening the legitimacy of Stephen's reign. He couldn't remove the past, but he could exorcise it, so he turned his rage on the corpse. It began with whispers in the Lateran halls, talk of an unprecedented synod, a trial of the dead. At first, even Rome's serpents were hesitant. No pope had ever desecrated another, but Stephen wasn't thinking like a pope. He was thinking like a cornered beast. He didn't want to reverse Formosus's policies. He wanted to erase his existence. His logic was madness sharpened into ritual. If Formosus had never legally been pope, then every act he performed was invalid. Every bishop he ordained, stripped. Every ruling, null. Every enemy he blessed, unblessed. Every alliance he forged, burned to ash. This wasn't about theology. This was about war, rewriting reality, corpse first. And so the preparations began. The grave was opened. Formosus's body was exhumed, limp, worm-eaten, half fused to its shroud. The church cleaned it, not to honor it, but to parade it. They dressed it in full papal regalia, white linen hiding the rot, red silk covering the dark patches where the skin had collapsed. They bound its limbs with cords so it wouldn't fall apart in front of the cameras, the judgmental eyes of cardinals and commoners alike. And Stephen stood ready, sharpening his voice like a blade. But behind the theatrics was something worse, something Stephen couldn't contain. He began to unravel. His sermons turned bitter, his eyes more bloodshot. He muttered to himself. Some nights, they say, he walked barefoot in the catacombs, whispering curses at stone coffins. His advisors urged caution, but he dismissed them. The trial would go forward, and not just as punishment, as performance, as warning. Because Stephen didn't just want to condemn Formosus, he wanted Rome to watch. He wanted every bishop, every noble, every rival to see what happens when you cross the wrong man, even from the safety of the grave. He wanted the world to know that not even death could shield you from his will. And when the day came, the city turned out, curious, horrified, hungry. The Basilica of St. John Lateran became a theater of the damned. They brought in the corpse like a king returning from battle. And Stephen, dressed in full papal glory, rose to deliver the most monstrous sermon Rome had ever heard. But what Stephen didn't understand, what he never could, was that horror, once unleashed, doesn't stop at the target. It spreads, it lingers. And when you tear a corpse from the grave and hold it up like a trophy, the blood doesn't just stain your hands, it soaks into your soul. And soon, it would turn back on him. Because what followed that day, the trial, the judgment, the desecration, would not end with Formosus. It would end with Stephen VI, broken, hunted, and screaming in the dark. A city in turmoil. Rome was no longer a city. It was a carcass with a crown. The marble was still white, the cathedrals still towering, but everything underneath had turned to rot. The streets reeked of urine and incense. Nobles paraded in gold, while beggars gnawed on bones in the shadow of basilicas. The empire was gone, but the rituals remained, hollow and dripping with menace. And at the center of it all was the church, bleeding from within, feasting on its own. By the late 9th century, the papacy had become less a throne of God and more a throne of corpses, traded and twisted by aristocratic clans like war spoils. The Theophylacts, the Spoltans, the Tusculans. They didn't believe in heaven, they believed in inheritance. And the popes, they were pawns, fat, sickly, terrified men who either served a family's ambition or ended up strangled in the night. No one stayed in power long. The only certainty was betrayal. Formosus had been one of them, a bishop, a pope, a player, and now, thanks to Stephen's psychotic theater, he had become something worse, a symbol, a warning. Rome had witnessed the impossible. A dead pope put on trial, mutilated, paraded, and hurled into the Tiber like a criminal whose guilt bled beyond the grave. It was meant to assert order, to show that the throne of Peter still held judgment, even in deaths. But instead, it shattered everything. Because if the dead weren't safe, then who was? If a pope could be dug up, dressed like a doll, cursed in front of the masses, and torn limb from limb by ceremony, What did that say about the church? About God? About salvation? Whispers turned to tremors. People began asking questions out loud. Some said the water in the Tiber ran darker that week. Others claimed animals refused to go near the basilica. A few even said they saw shadows moving inside the church at night, shadows with no breath and no face. The clergy tightened their jaws, the nobles turned inward, but the peasants, they began to riot, first in alleys, then in markets. Then outside the very doors of the Lateran itself. They didn't cry out for justice, they cried out for purging. The rituals were tainted, the sacraments smelled of blood. The Pope, the living Pope, was being called maledictus, cursed, possessed. Some whispered that Stephen had summoned demons into the church, that the desecration of Formosus had invited something unholy to nest inside the city's bones. And they weren't wrong. Because horror, once committed in the name of God, does not disappear, it multiplies. And Rome was starting to feel it. It wasn't just a corpse that had been judged, it was faith itself. And the people finally began to see their shepherds not as saints, but as butchers. Stephen, meanwhile, was unraveling faster than the vestments he stripped from Formosus. He barked orders in the dead of night, surrounded himself with armed guards, and refused to walk the streets. He accused his own advisors of conspiracy. He threatened excommunication for imaginary crimes. One night, they say, he screamed that Formosus was speaking to him from the river, calling him thief of the grave and bishop of worms. His eyes hollowed, his lips trembled, and still he called himself God's hand. But God had already left Rome. What remained was power, raw, brutal, ancient, and now desperate. The line between ritual and madness was gone. The throne of Saint Peter had become a stage for death. And the crowd, once entertained, was now howling for blood, living blood. And they wouldn't have to wait long, because the next act of this grotesque liturgy would begin with a trial unlike any the church had ever dared conduct. And the defendant wasn't a heretic, it was a corpse, again. The trial of the dead. The basilica was cold, even in Rome's choking spring, not the kind of cold born of stone or shade, but the kind that comes when something sacred dies in silence and no one notices. St. John Lateran, once a house of God, now reeked of mildew, blood oil, and rot sealed beneath layers of incense. There were no angels here, only witnesses. The throne had been set, raised above the marble altar, dressed in crimson and gold. Upon it sat a corpse, propped upright by ropes hidden beneath its vestments, head slumped sideways, jaw unhinged, hands blackened from decay. Pope Formosus, or what was left of him, had returned not as a spirit, not as a saint, but as the defendant in the most grotesque spectacle the church had ever staged. And the people of Rome came to watch. They came in silence, not out of reverence, but because they didn't understand what they were about to see. Even in a city drunk on violence and politics, no one had imagined this. A corpse hauled into court, dressed in holy robes, and called to account as if death were a delay, not an escape. There were bishops in attendance, soldiers, deacons, senators, and beyond them, common men and women packed shoulder to shoulder, clutching rosaries, crossing themselves again and again, as if that alone could keep the stench of sin from crawling under their skin. At the front stood Pope Stephen VI, alive in body but possessed in spirit by vengeance, by fear, or by something worse. His eyes were glass. His hands trembled not from age, but from the weight of what he was about to unleash. He raised his staff, not to bless, but to accuse. The charges echoed like thunder against stone, that Formosus had ascended illegally to the papacy, that he had violated canon law by abandoning his old see, that he had conspired with foreign kings, lied before God, mocked the sacred office of Peter. But Stephen's voice cracked not with authority, but obsession. This was no trial, it was a ritual, a twisted mass dressed in the language of law. And then the defense. A deacon, pale as ash, stood beside the corpse, his role to speak for the dead, to answer each question directed to the blackened husk beside him. Yes, no, the Pope offers no response. He said it again and again, eyes wide, throat dry, voice mechanical, like someone trapped inside a nightmare with no way out. Sometimes the corpse tilted forward as if nodding. Other times, its jaw creaked slightly open as if trying to scream. Some in the audience gasped. Others wept. One man vomited quietly into his sleeve, and then came the moment Stephen had waited for. He rose from his throne and walked, slow, deliberate, toward the corpse. The guards stepped back. The crowd held its breath. With his right hand, Stephen reached for the dead Pope's hand, not in reverence, but in desecration. And with a small, curved knife, he sliced, once, twice, 3 times, severing the thumb, the index, and the middle finger. The fingers that had once blessed kings, baptized children, and sealed papal decrees. Now they fell limp to the marble like dead worms, bloodless, but the act was louder than any scream. This was not justice. This was execution after the grave. Stephen held up the severed digits like trophies. These, he spat, have no authority here, not in this world, not in the next. The basilica didn't breathe. Then slowly, one by one, Stephen ordered the rest, strip the vestments. The sacred robe was torn from Formosus's chest. The pallium ripped, the sandals yanked off his rotting feet, the rings pried off bone with force. What remained was a shriveled man bound to a chair, naked, but for a linen loincloth, head slumped, as if even in death he was ashamed. But it wasn't over. Stephen stepped back. A sentence was pronounced. All ordinations and appointments made by Formosus were null and void, his reign erased, his name stricken from the records of the living and the dead. He had not been pope. He had never been pope. He was a fraud, a heretic, a worm in white. The court dispersed, but the horror continued. Formosus's desecrated body was dragged, yes, dragged out of the basilica. Down the stairs, across the plaza, through Rome's filth-strewn alleys, his head struck stones, his spine twisted against cart ruts. People turned away, dogs barked, children cried. The guards didn't care, the church didn't stop them. Because in this city of shadows, even the sacred could be butchered if the right men gave the nod. At the riverbank, they didn't whisper a prayer. They didn't give him coins for the ferryman. They simply heaved the corpse into the Tiber, limbs flailing for a moment before sinking like sin itself into the black. Rome was silent, but silence is not peace, because when you desecrate a corpse, you don't just destroy a man. You unleash something older, something darker, something that doesn't forget. And that night, as Rome went to sleep under its blood-stained stars, the whispers began, Stephen will be next. Rituals of desecration. The Tiber didn't protest. It simply opened its black mouth and swallowed him whole. Formosus, former vicar of Christ, former ruler of the Holy See, now nothing more than rotting meat drifting through the veins of a dying city. And with that final splash, Pope Stephen VI believed it was over, that the stench of the past had been drowned, that power had finally made itself clean by washing itself in death. But power never washes clean. It stains deeper with every drop. The rituals didn't end at the river. They echoed in the churches, in the minds of the clergy, in the bedrooms of trembling bishops. Rome had witnessed something it couldn't explain, something that twisted liturgy into execution and faith into spectacle. And Stephen, mad with confidence, now leaned fully into the blasphemy he had created. He wasn't afraid. He was reborn. He began revising the records, not rewriting, erasing. Every document signed by Formosus, destroyed. Every bishop ordained by him, declared illegitimate. Entire dioceses thrown into chaos. Marriages annulled. Sacraments questioned. Infants baptized by Formosus's hands were said to be untouched by grace. It was as if the man's soul had infected the church like a plague, and Stephen was the surgeon cutting out the rot, flesh, bone, and all. But the knife was dull, and he was cutting blind. And then came the masks. In private, behind closed doors, rumors claimed Stephen held new ceremonies. Not for God, for control. He gathered loyal bishops late at night, forced them to reenact the Cadaver Synod, with effigies, with robes, with mock trials, playing judge, jury, and executioner over and over, like some deranged priest performing black mass in the ruins of a once holy city. The basilica became a theater of ritual humiliation. Sometimes witnesses claimed he spoke to the air, whispered commands to ghosts, demanded silence from shadows. One servant fled, claiming she saw Stephen cradling the severed fingers of Formosus in a linen pouch, rocking back and forth, eyes rolled white, chanting, "He still points at me." The horror wasn't just spiritual anymore, it was viral. Bishops began to flee. The Roman people, once passive, now snarled. Graffiti appeared on church walls, "The Dead Sea. The river will not keep him." Rumors spread that Formosus's body had resurfaced, bloated but intact, tangled in river roots like a relic refusing burial. A fisherman swore the corpse had drifted to shore, fingers outstretched in judgment. Another said the eyes had opened, all fantasy maybe, all invention, but in a Rome this rotten fantasy had teeth. The church panicked, dissent grew within the ranks, priests began refusing orders, pilgrims stopped coming. The faithful grew cold, because if this was how Rome treated its holy dead, what hope did the living have? The Eucharist tasted like blood, the incense like fire, Mass became silent, baptisms halted, marriages were postponed. The body of the church itself had entered rigor mortis, and Stephen, he felt it. Oh, he felt it. He slept with a blade, changed chambers nightly, trusted no one, his guards were doubled, his food tasted before he touched it. He wore relics around his neck like armor, bone fragments, crosses, shards of supposed saints, all powerless against what truly hunted him, the weight of desecration. Because once you've cut the fingers off a pope, once you've hurled the holy into a sewer and laughed, you don't just await earthly judgment, you invite something older, something colder. Because deep down, Stephen knew what he had done. Not just to Formosus, but to Rome, to God, to himself. And as the city began to stir beneath him like a beast waking from a drugged sleep, he began to hear things in the floorboards, in the river winds, in the sacred silence of the altar. The ritual had been completed, the corpse was gone, but the curse had only just begun, and it would fall not on the people, not on the priests, not on the church, it would fall on him. Rituals of desecration. The Tiber didn't protest. It simply opened its black mouth and swallowed him whole. Formosus, former vicar of Christ, former ruler of the Holy See, now nothing more than rotting meat drifting through the veins of a dying city. And with that final splash, Pope Stephen VI believed it was over, that the stench of the past had been drowned, that power had finally made itself clean by washing itself in death. But power never washes clean. It stains deeper with every drop. The rituals didn't end at the river. They echoed in the churches, in the minds of the clergy, in the bedrooms of trembling bishops. Rome had witnessed something it couldn't explain, something that twisted liturgy into execution and faith into spectacle. And Stephen, mad with confidence, now leaned fully into the blasphemy he had created. He wasn't afraid. He was reborn. He began revising the records, not rewriting, erasing. Every document signed by Formosus, destroyed. Every bishop ordained by him, declared illegitimate. Entire dioceses thrown into chaos. Marriages annulled. Sacraments questioned. Infants baptized by Formosus's hands were said to be untouched by grace. It was as if the man's soul had infected the church like a plague, and Stephen was the surgeon cutting out the rot, flesh, bone, and all. But the knife was dull, and he was cutting blind. And then came the masks. In private, behind closed doors, rumors claimed Stephen held new ceremonies. Not for God, for control. He gathered loyal bishops late at night, forced them to reenact the Cadaver Synod, with effigies, with robes, with mock trials, playing judge, jury, and executioner over and over, like some deranged priest performing black mass in the ruins of a once holy city. The basilica became a theater of ritual humiliation. Sometimes witnesses claimed he spoke to the air, whispered commands to ghosts, demanded silence from shadows. One servant fled, claiming she saw Stephen cradling the severed fingers of Formosus in a linen pouch, rocking back and forth, eyes rolled white, chanting, "He still points at me." The horror wasn't just spiritual anymore, it was viral. Bishops began to flee. The Roman people, once passive, now snarled. Graffiti appeared on church walls, "The Dead Sea. The river will not keep him." Rumors spread that Formosus's body had resurfaced, bloated but intact, tangled in river roots like a relic refusing burial. A fisherman swore the corpse had drifted to shore, fingers outstretched in judgment. Another said the eyes had opened, all fantasy maybe, all invention, but in a Rome this rotten fantasy had teeth. The church panicked, dissent grew within the ranks, priests began refusing orders, pilgrims stopped coming. The faithful grew cold, because if this was how Rome treated its holy dead, what hope did the living have? The Eucharist tasted like blood, the incense like fire, Mass became silent, baptisms halted, marriages were postponed. The body of the church itself had entered rigor mortis. And Stephen, he felt it. Oh, he felt it. He slept with a blade, changed chambers nightly, trusted no one. His guards were doubled. His food tasted before he touched it. He wore relics around his neck like armor, bone fragments, crosses, shards of supposed saints, all powerless against what truly hunted him, the weight of desecration. Because once you've cut the fingers off a pope, once you've hurled the holy into a sewer and laughed, you don't just await earthly judgment, you invite something older, something colder. Because deep down, Stephen knew what he had done. Not just to Formosus, but to Rome, to God, to himself. And as the city began to stir beneath him like a beast waking from a drugged sleep, he began to hear things in the floorboards, in the river winds, in the sacred silence of the altar. The ritual had been completed, the corpse was gone, but the curse had only just begun, and it would fall not on the people, not on the priests, not on the church, it would fall on him. Collapse of a pontiff. Power, when taken too far, doesn't just collapse, it devours its wielder from the inside. And for Pope Stephen VI, the feast had begun, not by dagger, not by poison, but by madness, slow and rotting, fed day after day by his own rituals. The city that once obeyed him now stared in silence. No more cheers, no more reverence, just whispers, just fear. Even his allies, the ones who crowned him, propped him up, whispered vengeance in his ear, had begun to step back, as if afraid that whatever he had unleashed might still be clinging to his skin. It started with murmurs inside the curia. Clerics refusing to speak his name. Bishops refusing to attend synod. The guards grew nervous, jittery. Priests confessed to strange dreams. Formosus appearing at the altar, bleeding from his severed fingers, mouth sewn shut, but eyes blazing with holy rage. A sacristan dropped dead during midnight mass. A nun cut out her own tongue. The church didn't call it divine punishment. They didn't call it anything, because to speak of what was happening was to acknowledge it was real. And Stephen, he unraveled like wet cloth. He stopped sleeping in the Lateran. He claimed it was haunted, that he heard footsteps behind the walls, that the floorboards bled when he walked barefoot, that the candles whispered his name. He moved into a fortress across the Tiber, locked the doors, and ordered that no mirrors be allowed in his presence. "He watches me through my reflection," he hissed. "His face is wrong." He began purging his own circle. Close aides were arrested, interrogated, tortured. Some were executed without trial, their bodies dumped in alleyways, mouths stuffed with riverweed. A warning from no one, sent to everyone. The more he tried to purge the ghosts, the more he became one. Rome's bishops began to meet in secret. Even the Spoltans, his former backers, knew he had become a liability. He wasn't a pope anymore. He was a walking omen. A reminder that some sins can't be buried, even under stone. And then came the breaking point. One night, during a rainstorm that washed the city in blood-colored mud, the doors to Stephen's fortress burst open, not with soldiers, but with priests. Real priests, tired, furious, and sanctified by desperation. No swords, just ropes and holy oil. They found him screaming in his chambers, naked, surrounded by bones, not relics, but animal skeletons arranged in circles. He begged them not to take him, said Formosus would punish them all, that the river had a mouth now, that God no longer answered him. He was dragged from the room like a mad dog, his screams echoing down stone corridors. Locked in a cellar beneath a monastery, alone, forgotten, and there he rotted, not physically, not yet, but mentally, spiritually, piece by piece. No trial, no mercy. Just darkness, cold water, and a body that had finally outlived the thing it once housed. They say his last night was silent, that he didn't scream, that he didn't cry, just lay there, waiting. And when they opened the cell at dawn, they found him slumped in the corner, eyes bulging, purple marks across his neck, strangled, likely by his own guards, possibly by someone more committed. No culprit was ever charged. No prayer was said over his corpse. No tomb was marked. He was buried nameless, powerless, pope in title, forgotten in death. And yet Rome didn't heal, because when a man like Stephen dies, it doesn't cleanse the city, it reminds it. Every stone still remembers. Every altar still echoes with the chants of that unholy trial. And the church, desperate to reclaim dignity, would try to bury the past, rebellious the desecrated, rewrite the story. But no amount of papal decree could undo what had been done, because the Cadaver Synod wasn't just a crime, it was a ritual rupture, a tear between flesh and soul, between power and holiness. And the curse hadn't finished spreading. The corpse was gone, Stephen was gone, but their shadows still moving, and Rome would spend the next century learning what it means to live beneath a throne that once judged the dead. Aftermath and echoes through time. The corpse was gone, the mad pope was dead, but Rome was not clean. The blood hadn't dried, the river still whispered, and inside the Vatican walls, the stench of desecration clung like a second skin. No bells rang for Stephen, no liturgy honored his passing. The church wanted him forgotten, not just erased, but scrubbed from memory, like a stain that proved the throne of Saint Peter could be hijacked by a lunatic in robes. But power leaves residue, and the Cadaver Synod, that trial of a corpse, that grotesque liturgy of hatred, had ruptured something deeper than any wound the church had ever known. Its authority, its sanctity, and worst of all, its illusion of divine infallibility. Rome had eaten one of its own, and now it would choke on the bones. The backlash came fast. Just a few months after Stephen's death, a new pope rose. Theodore II, a man less concerned with vengeance than with repair. One of his first acts, to retrieve the body of Formosus. Fishermen were sent to scour the banks of the Tiber. They found the corpse tangled in reeds, half devoured, bloated with the weight of holy silence, and yet still intact enough to recognize. Still clutching, they said, at the folds of his shredded papal vestments. Some believed it was a miracle, others a warning, but Theodore ordered the body cleansed, reclothed, and reburied in honor, this time within the Vatican itself. No trial, no judgment, just the silence of contrition, but even that wasn't enough. Because the wound wasn't just physical, it was doctrinal, spiritual, symbolic. Rome had violated something sacred, and no number of prayers could erase the memory of a pope mutilated by another pope. So when Pope John IX took the throne, he went further. He convened a synod of his own, not to judge the dead, but to condemn the living. He invalidated the Cadaver Synod entirely, declared it unlawful, heretical, and depraved. All records from the trial were to be destroyed. All bishops deposed by Formosus were restored. And most critically, he banned outright the trial of the dead, forever. But law can only silence a crime, it can't erase it. The church moved on. The centuries rolled forward. Popes came and went. Kingdoms rose and collapsed. But the Cadaver Synod remained, buried in the stone and scripture like a maggot that refuses to die. Historians called it a moment of madness. Theologians called it a crisis of apostolic continuity. But the people, the ones who whispered in alleys and prayed in silence, they called it something else, a curse. Because once a church proves it can dig up its own saints, strip them, butcher them, and drown them without mercy, what does it stand for? Once you sever the fingers that bless, what remains of the blessing? Some say the synod was a singular event, an aberration, a glitch in the moral order of history. But they're wrong. Because what happened in 897 wasn't an accident. It was a revelation. That power, left unchecked, will not just silence its enemies. It will resurrect them, only to humiliate them one last time. That hatred wrapped in ritual becomes holiness in disguise. That even the holiest throne on earth can turn into a butcher's block when fear and revenge sit higher than God. And if you think this ended with Formosus, if you believe the church never again turned on itself, never again weaponized its sacraments, never again exiled the dead to make the living feel safe, then look again. Look closer. The cadaver may no longer sit on trial, but the ghosts of power never truly leave the room. History doesn't always whisper. Sometimes it screams. Through bones unearthed, through rituals gone wrong, through thrones that rot from within. The Cadaver Synod wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror, and the reflection still stares back at us. If you're drawn to stories like this, where power corrodes, where faith fractures, where the dead don't always stay buried, then this is the place. Stick around. There are more shadows to uncover, more crowns to crack, and more truths they tried to bury.